Hey, listen, when I tell you, you segue right into another brilliant, like I said, these things just start firing off as I heard you talk, man. Like, so again, during the conversation, right? The question was posed to me, and I pose it to you. Brother Marcus Garvey had this very different ideology, right? Brother W.E.B. Du Bois even said that he was the most dangerous person to the Negro culture in America because he had this mindset and mentality that if we wanted liberty, we had to strike the first blow, right? That I think he was quoted by saying, and I'm going to look it up because I don't want to mess it up. If you must be free, you must become so through your own efforts. Until you produce what the white man has produced, you will not or never be his equal. And so I asked you this question because you know the ideology of Marcus Garvey, which was, hey, we got to create our own states, right? We got to create our own nations and countries and kingdoms and tell me how, like, if he were here in this, what would the embodiment of a Marcus Garvey say if someone were to say, well, look how far we've come, right? Like we have or had a black president. We have or we have HBCUs, we've got great schools, right? We've done some stuff in this land, if you will, that's not our own. So tell me in your words, and I know I threw that at you, but we
You
just having a
did.
conversation on this here Sunday. Like what would you say to that question? Like if a Marcus Garvey were here and someone asked him, like, Marcus, like, look at what we've done.
Well,
Have
I'm
we
gonna speak.
progressed?
I'm gonna speak as Marcus Garvey,
Yes,
but then
channel
I've gotta,
him.
and this is because of philosophically where he was coming from, I think. But then I have some disagreements even to some of the ideas of striking the first blow, and I'll get to that in a moment. But
Yeah,
if
yeah.
Garvey was here, Garvey would look and say, you have symbolic movement without substance transformation. Because Marcus Garvey's whole premise was ownership.
Yes.
And his whole premise was it's not enough to be in the space or to be the first, but do you own the system so that you can reconstruct a different system? And that was his whole philosophy, again, of his whole Pan African reality of coming together, even of his own ownership of again an ocean liner, etc. Garveyites were all about ownership, which influenced again Malcolm and the Nation of Islam and their thinking, because I think Malcolm's father was a Garveyite as well. So Marcus would look at us and say, why are you surprised that there's gentrification taking place in Raleigh? Because you didn't own any property anyway. Why are you surprised that gentrification is going on? Because many of your leaders didn't put systems and structures, and some of you have been fine with celebrating being the entertainer, being the spokesperson, but not really being an owner. And you haven't taught people how to be an owner. And my generation, again, and some of it, this is where history comes in. You have to remember this. My parents were born in 1923. So that's only 60 some years since the Emancipation Proclamation. And if they're born in 1923, only 60 years from the Emancipation Proclamation, my father is just trying to survive because he's now spends the majority of his life in a Jim Crow reality. My father dies in 1990. Well, if he dies in 1990 and the Civil Rights Act signed until 1965, then we know that that didn't automatically lead to access. So my father has had a very short window of time of being able to walk and journey in the freedom of what it even means to be an American citizen. He has spent so we're talking my father. So this is why, and again, I was born in 1961. So then this means that even in my family, my children are the first generation in my family to be born in freedom.
Hey, pause there. Pause there. Wow. I need everybody to understand that. Pause there and understand that, right? Like that's got to land for you because what one would say is, and I'm saying in the sense of, I've even heard my own students say this. Well, that was then. It's like, man, do you realize the repercussions? Do you realize that the wealth gap is as large as the wealth gap is? It's because of those things. That the impacts of that time period is exactly the reason why, as you mentioned, we don't own much of anything. We couldn't. You see what I'm saying? So, wow, man. I just had to
So
I apologize for stopping you,
no,
but
no,
that was powerful. That was
no.
powerful.
So I get it. And this is where some of us are hard on our parents because we say they didn't tell us the story. And let
Yeah.
me tell you, I am also have to apologize to my own children because there are times I didn't teach the story as effectively as I should have to my own children.
That's good.
Because I realized I've had to go through a journey because I was born in 1961. And those of us born in 1961, I graduated from East Carolina, ECU, go
All right.
Pirates. But we got to remember, we were part of that celebrated generation to where our parents told us something that I'm not sure was helpful. I don't want you to suffer the way I suffered.
That's good.
And what you need to do, especially growing up in rural North Carolina, my father thought success was is that when you have a certain economic uh, portfolio. You work for a company, and if you can work and are treated with dignity, because like my dad, again, only certain spaces you could go to, but you can now go and navigate in white spaces, and now you can be a leader. So he's thinking about that he has a son that has a humanity that he didn't have an opportunity to have. He wasn't thinking as much, at least I wasn't listening clearly about being an owner and ownership. Because it's amazing what he went through 11th grade education and even purchasing and having a home. And that's why material things were so important to him. That's why even my father, who worked in the shipyard, would get tailor made suits. And he got tailor made suits, not because he was hanging out in necessarily places where he needed tailor made suits. Now, my mom was an AKA, and
Okay.
so he would go again to many of her events, and that's when he would pull out his suits. But my dad was a man who was all about just finding the identity of the beauty of what it means to be a black man.
Yes.
And so the idea of ownership, especially having lived with a uncle who was a sharecropper, wasn't sealed. And I think some of that is our own self-esteem work as well and what we have done. Because many of us today, we celebrate the first. And I still say this, the first don't mean as much as we think. Because the first, without creating the space for a second and a third and a fourth, is really meaningless because first is symbolic representation rather than systemic realities and systemic change. And
Yes.
so I think that's part of it for us. So even for some of us who are in spaces of influence and power, we're just not in a time period where now we've got this person here and man, they are doing this. And yeah, we can applaud, but how do we begin helping people understand ownership becomes key? And we see this in entertainment. I mean, again, that's why the NFL looks the way it looks because the owners do not look like us or even sympathetic or empathetic to us. That is in every industry. So, one of the realities that I'm excited about is that there's a generation who understand ownership, and that is
Good.
what's brilliant about this platform right here is because now ownership, there's more access to that. So I
Yes.
think we're in a time period now where it is Garvey's ideas can be put in a healthy framework of ownership. And yet
Yes.
that
Yes.
ownership has to come with a stewardship. And this is where ownership and stewardship must go together. and a stewardship of your whole life, but a stewardship of understanding your responsibility for others who can't be owners. And this is where our collective response and what Dr. King talked about as the beloved community becomes very important in the time that we are in. Because the truth of the matter is, how you are a steward of what you own is going to determine whether or not it is lasting. Because Booker T. Washington was a steward of what he owned, Tuskegee still exists today. Because Martin Luther King was a steward of his ideas and his movement philosophies. And because he understood this idea of what I would call collective connection, his idea, John Lewis, Jesse Jackson, Andrew Young, Julian Bond, James Farmer, uh, Fannie Lou Hamer, Ella Baker, and many others moved in the stewarding of what Martin Luther King did of understanding the power of the civil rights movement. And it's not, and Dr. King understood it was not his power to give away. He was simply being a spokesperson. But this is why we hijack King and we want to make him false ownership. Dr. King did not own anything. He understood his role as spokesperson, change agent, and movement engagement. But that's why his systemic things that he did as he was in different places all across the country really led and built the civil rights movement. And so some of this is the long way of getting to what Garvey would say, what many times where we are today.
Yes, yes. Listen, man, I promise you, I won't hold you too much longer on this
No,
here
you
Sunday,
good.
but I've gotta soak as much of this up as I can, right? So take me now to the past couple of years, right? You recently did a program that I have had the opportunity to go back and look at, and it was fire, right? And you all talked a little bit about where we've come in the past 2 years. And we talked a lot about, companies pledging dollars for diversity, equity, and inclusion initiatives, people really starting to see, right? Black people and the plight of who we are and what we've done and how we've struggled, our accomplishments. You talked about the inequities that still exist. We talked about, the isms, um, and the prejudice and bias that still creep up in some of our major industries. And what I want for you to do for us in these last few moments we have together is to paint for me the reality. We talk you oftentimes you do this so eloquently. You're able to paint for us the reality of why we exist and how we're being treated or experience these moments. And I want for me to just think about the past few years. You mentioned George Floyd, we mentioned Ahmaud. We've had conversations about all of these things, the police brutality and the whole Black Lives Matter movement, and if it will ever be able to centralize the voices of Black people. Talk to me though, like in these last few moments about just where we are
Yeah,
in your philosophy on how we move forward.
yeah, I think it's a couple of things. I think first of all, um, if I was talking to black people, I think we're in a place where at some point, how do we begin embracing the collective approach? And a collective approach is we still have these ideas that some people are discounted because they're not doing this, rather than even seeing ourselves systemically engaged. So, for example, you have some who say, well, if you're not protesting, then you're really not down with the movement. You have some who suggest, well, and then we even now have generational gaps, we have ageism. There's some who say, well, see, you're really not feeling me or really don't understand me because your age and your generation is past and we're having to step in and do what you didn't do. And so even you have some who now have a level of wealth and who have a level of privilege and position, and as if that means that you've arrived and you've made a contribution, and there are gaps, and if you don't use certain language, and there are terms and phrases that we even use to see whether or not you really understand. And so if you haven't, read Dr. Ibram X. Kendi's book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, and if you're not talking being anti-racist, that somehow you're not engaged in what real change is. And I think at some point we've got to say we're at different places, but can we at least begin to say that let's convene and move in the same direction and not allow the false divisions to divide us? Because there are false divisions to divide sort of a collective movement that could really bring change. Because I think we need people who at least have an understanding that are in both parties. I think we need people who have understanding that are on the ground, that are disruptive. We need disruptive technologies. A disruptive technology is disrupting so that something can be put back to where it needs to be. But we also need constructive system builders to also. And so I think we're going to have to figure out how can we begin to find some themes of collaboration and movement collectively together. I think for many, those of us who are responding, and I'm going to speak directly to white leaders, you may see me, but I'm wondering, do you feel me? And I think part of what is that right now, because of media technology, you see me, but do you feel? And when I say do you feel, have you engaged the fullness of the story? Because you may have engaged a view of the story, but you don't feel me if when we look at George Floyd and you immediately change the conversation to the data of Black on Black crime. You don't feel me if you engage a conversation about a young child being murdered, being killed. You don't feel me if you go to data, if you go to an explanation, if you have questions of what that child was doing. You don't feel me if there's not empathy that breaks your soul that George Floyd is crying for his mother. When your analysis is more concerned about whether or not there's certain dynamics and legal and giving an explanation rather than an empathetic engagement with the story, then you don't feel me. You don't feel me if you can't look and see that some of the narratives and brutalities that have existed in our globe, some of the ideas came right here from America. The ideas of a Hitler and Nazi Germany. You don't feel me if you can't feel the fact that we had the audacity to send Black men who come out of a Jim Crow reality to fight against a tyrant who also said that because of race, a person is less human, and practice many systems and structures that were learned from the torturous history of slavery. And there are several scholars who will say this, not just me. Do you know that in the Nuremberg trial, and you may need to Google that if you've never are not familiar with this, but in the Nuremberg trial, when they tried to try the war criminals of Nazi Germany, they used the justification of what was going on in America to justify their inhumane treatment of Jewish people. Unless you're willing to really peer and look and see that, then you don't feel me. And you got to ask yourself the question, because now we're in a time where there's no excuses, because certainly we should be able to feel what is going on right now. Even when we look at the dilemma that is existing, even now as we have this conversation of people who are having to hide under subways, of people whose lives we're looking on camera, who husbands are having to say once again that the government is saying that, listen, you will need to leave your wife and children. And if you're 16 to 60, then you will have to stay and fight against Putin with us. And we're looking at images of refugees, of women and children being separated from their husbands If you can feel that, then you mean you can't feel 240 years, 9 generations of people who can't even have the humanity of owning their own bodies. And if you can't make that connection, then you don't feel me. You don't feel me when you can drive through parts of this community of the triangle that we live in and be in neighborhoods and look around and there's not a Harris Teeter or a Whole Foods. There's not a place of healthy food. You don't feel me. Even if you give your dollars philanthropically, you give your dollars over there and you have over there and them rather than the pronouns that are properly we or us, then you don't feel me. And rather than moving away from these opportunities to feel me, you engage that. And this is where media becomes important. This is where movies becomes important. This is where music is important. Just like of old, you're able to feel me when you listen as well intently to what Marvin Gaye was saying and what's going on. Or you can feel me if you would just take the time and get beyond the pain again of Kendrick Lamar and his album Damn. And I know for some of you that I said that word, you will question me and wonder, but you see, Kendrick Lamar is speaking with the angry and pain of a people. And that's why you have to understand, of course, he would win the Pulitzer. And if you can't listen to that, then maybe you should check out To Pimp a Butterfly. You know, see, Kendrick Lamar knows the genius of words and even one word. But why does he do that? So that maybe you could listen and feel me. Because unfortunately, people couldn't feel, again, the spirituals, the realities of even what the church was trying to sing through the voices of Martin in the civil rights movement and those songs. Because you would feel me because you understand that the singing of those songs of hope would take place as people were going through for 240 years of the brutal treatment of slavery. And there's even historical fact that while Black people were being tortured and lynched, often to bring comfort, they would sing songs of their souls. And if you don't know about that, then maybe you don't feel me. And it's unfortunate that even those who come from unquote unquote, those who again, and I am a follower of Christ and not trying to push that in on anybody, but I say that to say sometimes I'm embarrassed because we've talked about this whole conversation is about history and about story. And the very story of the Bible is a story of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration. That's the main theme of that book that we put our hands on, the Bible. Side note, isn't it sad that even in court systems, they would have two Bibles, one for Black hands and one for white hands?
Yes.
When a book that suggests that we're created in the imago Dei, all of us are created in the image of God. But if you got a story of creation, fall, redemption, and restoration, then that story should be a story you know that every human being wants. And why is it that I'm supposed to stop at the problems of the fall? Why is it that as a Black person, the fall and maybe redemption, but why is it that we can't come together and make sure that there is restoration, even if it means reparations, especially if you come from a biblical worldview? But if you can't see that your own book says creation, fall, redemption, restoration, then maybe you're missing something and you got to ask, maybe you don't feel us yet.
Whew, God,
So
to
anyway,
wipe. Hey
we
man, let
got
me
to
tell you something.
started.
Let me tell you something. Every time, I mean this, I mean it. Every time I sit with you, I talk to you, I have the opportunity to experience this, man. You do something here, you do something here, man, and it just makes me want to just. I can't thank you enough. I really do mean that. I mean it. I mean it. I mean it. And I hope others understand that if you have people like this within your reach, within your grasp, you've got to do everything you can to build a relationship with them because even in the like we don't talk every day. We don't, you know what I mean? But it's the fact that when we do, it is something of substance, right? That it is substantial, man. Like I mean that, and I just appreciate you. I gotta ask these like final questions, right? And you're gonna get me because I'm gonna ask it anyway. So at some point, man, there has to be the James White podcast that we can subscribe to, or the James White book series about there's just gotta be something at some point that we gonna be able to, well, after, Lord forbid, you leave this earth. We're
Yeah.
like, hey man, you gotta pick this up, man. You gotta sit with this. You gotta listen to this, because those are some teachings and some words and some examples that man, everybody ain't putting that together for us in our communities. You know what I mean? Like, everybody's not,
Yeah.
that last part where you just went, you don't experience, like, you don't feel me. If I can only imagine if I had that knowledge in my back pocket when we were going through some of our diversity trainings, and we're like, but we understand and we want to, and it's like, well, if you don't, and then just go off and rattle these things like that, to me, man, if y'all ain't listening, if y'all weren't listening and writing down, because I was listening, taking notes, brother. Like, that's awesome. So,
Well,
wow,
and listen, thank you for the rebuke. I need some help in putting that together.
gotta get it
And
together.
and understand and understand this too. One of the things I now use my whole name. This I'll end on this
Yeah,
because my name is James Alfred White. And if you ever notice, people from my generation, we had pretty simple names that were named after our parents.
yeah,
I heard one thinker say it this way, that part of what was happening, and I never thought about this, is that your parents came from a narrative of slavery, and slaves would often name their children the name of their father because they knew the father could be sold, and the only thing that they would have left of the essence of that father would be his name and his child. So it's very common to have families where you everybody's name two and three Jameses when you're in a
yep.
room.
Junior this, junior
Yeah,
that.
junior
Yeah,
this and
yeah,
junior that. Because part of how we pass things on is in the very essence of who we are. And that's true even of our history. So I embody the story of my family in my name. And I didn't catch this until after my father died. For years, I was ashamed of my name, but my name is James Alfred White. Well, my daddy never knew his father. He had his name, John Franklin White, but he never knew him. Uh, my dad only had a brother. His only brother, his name was James. Now I had a very difficult relationship with my father growing up, even because he came from that generation where he had a lot of things. He had to protect his heart. So some of us who had black fathers from that time period, again, this is some of the trauma of Jim Crow. There wasn't this emotional, loving relationship. But when I began to put my name together, so his only brother's name was James. When he was given by his grandmother, because his mother had some issues and he was raised by his grandmother who couldn't raise him and his brother James anymore, he ended up in North Carolina with the two family members that he spent most of his life with, his Aunt Alice and Uncle Fred.
wow.
So my name, James Alfred White, is my daddy saying, your history cannot be limited to one period of time. So I embody the story of my family. And I embody that and I carry that story. And my hope is that we would somehow understand that even past generations simply wanted us and you, Greg, because you will go places I will never go, and I love that. That's why I will take the time on a Sunday afternoon to be with you because you're the reality of the story continuing. But just remember that again, we carry within us in more ways than ever history that will continue. And that's why I carry the story of my whole family that my dad had, James Alfred White. And
Wow,
man,
man.
that I'm just thankful for being with
And Alice and Uncle Fred, man. Wow, like,
you. Yeah.
listen, let me tell you something. Lessons learned. Do you understand? Lessons learned. Brother James Alfred White, I want to thank you for joining us. on this very special episode of all things substantial. And when I say you embody just the title of what I'm trying to create here, all things substantial.
Mm,
Like, I appreciate you, and this will not be the last time we
fantastic.
have these types of conversations. All right, you all, thank you so much for tuning in. I appreciate you. You have been listening to All Things Substantial again with Brother James Alfred White. I'm Greg Hedgepeth, President and CEO of Substantial Media LLC. The only reason that we exist is to ensure that you understand that our people embody the very thing that we are, which is substantial. Thank you.